Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to wrap up our look at the exploration and exploitation and discovery of the New World with other groups, other European powers, other entities. So let's get started. Spain was the first to establish a presence on the Americas outside of the natives, but it wasn't the only one that would. The reality that the Americas represented an unprecedented amount of money, wealth, expansion opportunities was too good to be passed up by the other European superpowers. In 97 and 98, Cabot left to try to find a better way across the Atlantic Ocean. The goal from him was to still figure out, can you get to Asia by going west? He gets to Newfoundland and does a lot of exploration along the northeastern part of the Americas. And he does this under the English flag, but again, he doesn't get to Asia. Giovanni de Veranzo, for France, he is going to go basically from the Carolinas all the way up to Nova Scotia. He is charting the length of all that. Cartier in 1534 is going to go down the St. Lawrence River, eventually gets to Montreal, Canada. And even though none of these guys find their way to the Pacific or even Asia, they do realize this area they have explored has lots of resources: fish, cod, timber, and a lot of places that they could expand upon. When the French first set up a fortification, they do so in Florida at Fort Caroline. Now, this is not so far from the Spanish forces at St. Augustine that both aren't aware of this. The decision to establish a presence here was, number one, for the French, a little bit of the, hey, if we're nearby and we get into a struggle, the Spanish are right there, maybe they'll help us out. And yes, it was also, hey, we need to make sure that the Spanish know we're here and we're going to stake a claim no matter what, so let's go not too far from them. And that's also what happened. Initially, some friendly natives of Florida did help the French colonists at Caroline survive, figured out some ways to, defend yourself, grow your forces and your foodstuffs, but ultimately the French starved, and Fort Caroline didn't survive too much more. The next year, relief does show up with lots more men, with lots more supplies, and Spain reacts seeing this as a threat. So in 1565, there is another arrival of Spaniards to Florida, and this time they aren't just bringing the soldiers. They're also bringing skilled artisans, stonecutters, craftsmen, weavers, the kind of stuff you bring when you are transplanting and creating a civilization as well. Now, be aware that yes, there were still soldiers that came. Half of the people who came were also soldiers, and there were also 24 families that show up as well. Spain is setting this up for the long haul. They are expecting this to be a long-term presence, and this is a simple way to show what they mean without necessarily showing up with a lot of soldiers. The French and the Spanish feared that this attack was going to come about one way or another, and in 1566 they collectively decided, kind of surprisingly, on the same day they were going to attack each other. The French felt that the Spanish bringing in families and craftsmen meant that they weren't willing to fight. The Spanish felt that the French needed so much assistance that they were going to be an easy win. And surprise, surprise, in the swamps of Cape Canaveral, the French find themselves in the muck, in the swamp. The Spaniards on the dry, firm ground are tactically in a better position. The assault there, it's one-sided. It's called a massacre for a reason. And one of the Spanish soldiers later wrote that I do not do this unto Frenchmen, but as unto Lutherans. He was more angry that, the Protestant church was here than the French were here. So France would kind of dispute a little bit of Florida, but not for a very long time, because when you look at the Americas, there's a lot of land. No reason to squabble over Florida. France was the most populous state in Europe. It was also, compared to Spain and England and Holland, it's also the largest nation. So they start claiming a lot of land very quickly. And on this map, you can see the amount of land that France is going to claim. Yeah, there's some disputed area in what is now Georgia and South Carolina, a chunk of North Carolina too. But that was a small thing compared to the enormity of it. The French king at the time was wanting fur, and fur as a luxury item is really valuable. Fur on its own is a status symbol. When you are cold, you want something warm, and fur lasts long, maintains heat well, and shows you're rich. There was the nickname for fur-bearing animals as soft gold. Getting it back, that's going to make you a lot of money. And the Company of New France will be founded at this time. This was a business venture that's goal was to establish colonies throughout North America. And it was funded, it was given a lot of opportunity, and if you chose to try to go, you had to give 10% of what you made back to the crown. So it's also not, it's so little you have to go give back that most people who could didn't mind it. I mean, it was almost cheaper than your taxes. The father of New France would be this guy, Samuel de Champlain. He would create a settlement in Nova Scotia, and it failed. Number one, they didn't expect Nova Scotia to get as cold as it got, and number two, they expected there to be better vegetation in the area than there was, and he lost a lot of people to scurvy. Scurvy is what happens when you don't have a lot of vitamin C, and it causes your gums to recede, it causes your skin to change color, it can lead to kidney failure, and ultimately death. So it's really bad. He would go on after the failed settlement in Nova Scotia to establish Quebec. He tried to find the Northwest Passage. He didn't, but what he did find was, in some cases more important, the Great Lakes and the connecting Mississippi River. And from here, you could go south all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. He made alliances with native groups, and we see that the French, for the most part, they do this a lot. They are very willing to work with Native Americans and trade with them, and that was kind of the long-going thing. The French colonies really never grew too much. Number one, the French didn't want to settle. They didn't want to bring in families. They didn't want to bring in a lot of craftsmen. The goal was let's make money trading fur, and there's a lot of money to make on it. The people who came here, they were trappers, they were hunters. There were some settlers who were here, there were some farmers who were here, but you didn't have your middle class. You didn't have your people who have a skill, and a skill that you can pass on and something you can create. If you are a silversmith and you make silver spoons, that's great, but if no one's willing to buy the silver spoons, then all you have are some really fancy cookware. Canada was also not super attractive at this time. It got very cold. It was isolated from the rest of Western Europe and the rest of a lot of settlements entirely. In some cases, there was a real encouragement from the company to go. You were paid to go. In some cases, children were said, hey, why don't you go in the city? When they're overcrowded and we have too many people living in Paris or Nice or Marseille. Hey, we have a lot of people here. Why don't we just, go to New France? Lots of open space, lots of open place. But there's also no big cash crop. It's cold, you can't keep your food stuff, you see people dying of scurvy. It's not a lot of fun. Couple that with the fact that long-term fur trade is not great. If you start killing all the beavers, for example, you run into the problem of all the ecological problem that comes from that. What eats the beaver? Okay, what does the beaver eat? Why is that not around anymore? What happens because there's no more beaver? When the wolf can't eat the beaver, the wolf might go after the people. Alcohol, and this is not just a new French problem, this is an all-over problem. In the same way that fermented alcohol, in the same way that smallpox did not exist prior to Europeans bringing it, fermented alcohol, booze, did not exist in the Americas. So resistance to alcohol also did not exist at all. It was really damaging both to Native Americans at an individual basis and on a larger cultural basis. When the French missionaries show up, when the Jesuits show up, they do the same problems that the Spanish do. That we are the only way to salvation, and if you don't practice our ways, then you will be horribly punished and tortured. And that didn't work. That never worked. At no point did that work well. And then people started changing. The only reason it worked in Spain is because they kept bringing more and more people in with it, and were displacing the Native Americans with it. Your people in Canada, in the North America, they're fishermen, they're traders. They have no presence back in France. Those people who came here were looking to make a fast buck, an easy buck, and they could do that really pretty well. We do see that, like mestizos, there is a group that shows up called mitas, and that is going to be the blending of white people and Native Americans. The Dutch get involved in this as well, in the exploration colonization game. Henry Hudson is going to explore New York for the Dutch East India Company, and he tries to do the same thing, find the Northwest Passage. He goes down the Hudson River, doesn't find anything there, goes north through Canada. He thinks he gets somewhere there, but then he just finds he's in Hudson Bay. There's not a lot of successes that we get from this, aside from just filling in the map. The Dutch are going to go on to establish, though, and this is really important, the East India Company, a joint stock company where individual people buy shares in the company itself. And then when the company makes money, shareholders are able to make money off of that. This is the first of its kind, a joint stock company. This was the first one, but it is by no means the last or only one. Most companies are publicly traded today. Anything on the New York Stock Exchange is a publicly traded company. Apple, Starbucks, Disney, Coca-Cola. If it's a big company, it's a publicly traded company. Manhattan is going to be established in 1624, and this was just 30 families who settle on the island. And it lasted for about 4 decades before ultimately it was abandoned. For not too long. It's going to change hands more than be abandoned. The Dutch wanted money, and this is really the big thing that the Dutch and the French had in common, the goal of making money. They wanted to make money because it was, easy, and it's something you can do. The Dutch established Fort Orange, which is in Albany, Manhattan, which would become New Amsterdam, and the goal of these cities was to receive, process, then ship goods. Fort Orange would be receiving all the stuff that was coming from Europe, and Manhattan, New Amsterdam, would send all the furs, all the stuff they had found back home. And the state that would become the New Netherlands would grow into something really pretty surprising. We see that there's freedom of press. There is freedom of worship. As long as it's private, they really didn't care what you believed in, just so long as you keep your business to yourself. And the Dutch are also going to be the first to really dominate the Atlantic slave trade. Women were allowed to keep their own separate identity, and we see that this autonomy would allow the Dutch to have a lot of the freedoms that we would associate with, well, your basic freedoms. Just like all of them, the Dutch had their problems too. They were really pretty scrupulous when they made their land deals with the Indians, with the Native Americans. Minuet, the guy who traded, basically bought Manhattan, he bought it from the Native Americans for a box containing some beads. The idea of ownership was so foreign to these Native Americans that owning land seemed silly. But, ooh, those are some nice beads. Yeah, sure, why not? You can have that land. We're not using it this season. We'll take these shiny beads. And that's how that happened. The role of patronship was that if you can recruit people to come with you, then you could receive a lot of land yourself. For every 50 people that I pay to go across the Atlantic and settle a presence, I myself would get a couple hundred acres of land. Now that's great, but I still have to come up with 50 people who are willing to leave their home, venture into the unknown, and then I get land that I might not be able to directly live on yet. So it's not exactly the winningest thing there is. There were a series of Native American wars between the Dutch and the natives that caused part of the New Netherlands colonies to collapse. And wars came and went with the natives. One way that one set of wars ended was when Governor Stresemann, who was the governor of New Amsterdam, what would eventually become New York, tried to end the trade of guns with the Native Americans. And he feared that arming the Native Americans or trading food for guns with Native Americans would eventually lead to Native Americans being armed and problematic. And he was very correct, but he also wanted to fix the problem. Soisman was not a good guy in a lot of other ways. The Dutch forces that are here really emphasize trade rather than settlement. They are looking to make the money in the same way the French are willing to make the money. It's not, hey, let's stay here. It's, hey, let's make money here. The colony of New Amsterdam, it's this collection of different nations, of different religions, of different languages, and there was no cohesive thing binding people together. Even when Jewish individuals start showing up in 1654, Stuyvesant starts passing all these anti-Semitic laws and anti-Semitic policies, and afterwards the Jewish migrants, they just leave. Eventually, New Amsterdam is captured. There is a war between, a very brief war between the Dutch and the British, and the Dutch are more concerned with maintaining their African and East Indies trade networks and autonomy there than they are with the Americas. The Americas was just a place we could find a little bit of money and trade a little bit and get some furs. Oh, we do not want to lose the much more valuable East Indies to the Americas. Okay, forget it, we'll just give it up to you guys. And this is why the guy who will eventually become proprietor of the New Netherlands was the brother of the King of England, the Duke of York, and this is why we call New York, New York. It's named after him. That's why it's no longer named New Amsterdam. The Dutch would encourage people to come to this region. You come here, you work for 6 years, you get some free land. But a lot of the people who came here wouldn't settle there. The Dutch wanted to trade. They really weren't as interested in conquering North America. They were more interested in making money off it. There was a lot of cultural differences that we see between Europeans and the natives, and we have seen that a lot. We see how they're viewed based on religion, on the idea of what you own, on land ownership, the idea of who is in charge, a king who is ordained by Big G God versus a chief who is familially in charge, the role of land versus farms, even the idea of how you fight. These differences would be stark and pretty frequent through most of the American colonial experience. So, over the course of this, we've talked about the quote-unquote discovery of the New World, what happened with these different groups, and how these groups ultimately found conflict. Hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.